Woo. How's it going, guys? I think we are the last slot of Connect, so I hope you guys had a good show. And you probably figured it out by now, but this cryptic sounding title was because we hadn't announced Medium until the keynote. Otherwise, we would have just called it the talk about Medium. So I'm Brian Sharp, and I am the head of our San Francisco office and the team lead for Medium.
I'm Lydia Choy, and I'm a technical art director also on the Medium team.
And this is our talk about our development process for working with Medium. So we've been working on it for about 1.5 years now. We're really excited to be able to finally unveil it and show it to people. We've been demoing it here. We demoed it all day yesterday. They're demoing it right now. So hopefully a lot of you had a chance. Can I see like a show of hands? How many people managed to play with it? Whoa, awesome. Wow, success. That's really good. I guess the people who didn't are probably in line right now. So it is, it is a creation experience that we've been building for the Rift and the Touch controllers, and it is about sculpting digital clay. So a few words about where it came from. So both of us have had long careers in games and film, and specifically have been focused on building content pipelines and tools for artists. And both of us are artists. I'm kind of a noob, but I draw and I sculpt. And Lydia has been sculpting in clay for a decade. These are some of her sculptures. So both of us got really excited early on about using VR for creation. Because right now, you've got physical media like clay or sand or even just blocks or whatever. And they're super approachable and really viscerally satisfying, but they kind of are what they are, right? Like if you go to the beach and you make a sandcastle, you don't suddenly become part of a community of sandcastle builders able to share with each other, like you just built a sandcastle. And then on the other hand, you have the digital tools, which do have that side to them and make sharing and community much easier, but they have this barrier to entry, like a literal physical barrier between you and your work. So VR was this revelation for us because for the first time you're able to have the benefits of the digital medium and at the same time that kind of intimacy and presence and approachability of a physical one. So our target demographic includes the whole spectrum of people, artists, makers, and just anyone who loves making things in 3 dimensions, whether it's on a computer or in the real world. And our goal is to provide an artistic medium that feels as visceral and satisfying as working with clay. So whether you are a professional artist or a hobbyist or you just like doodling, we want it to be approachable and we want you to feel successful with it, and hopefully you guys did. We got a lot of good screenshots on Twitter that look like people had fun. But we also want it to be a skilled experience in the sense that with practice you can become better, right? You can develop skill and you will feel like you have the satisfaction of looking back at your work and being like, oh, I'm really improving. So the reason we're giving this talk is because of the content that we're building at Oculus. Medium is pretty unique in 2 ways. Right, so first, most VR experiences are designed to be really brief, right? It's just a game, you play it, and then you're done. Medium, you can easily sit down for an hour or 2 and use it, right, and lose track of time. And second, Medium is an app with a lot of state that you manage, right? There's state like the UI and the modes and the settings, and then there's also the data of the sculpture itself that you're creating, and that's a pretty big deal. So the code base looks like a game engine, but it also borrows a lot from productivity software. So it's kind of this unique set of challenges which we are excited to tackle because we think the space has so much potential. So our goal for this talk is that you guys leave having heard something that resonated with you, with some new ideas, because we want everyone here to be excited to help us figure this stuff out, because there's this whole class of software that we think has a really bright future, and the more of you that are involved in helping us figure it out, the faster we're going to get there. So with that, I will hand it over to Lydia.
Got the time lapse. Well, I'll let the time lapse play real quick.
Oh, right.
This is just our artist Bernard. I told him to make a cute kitty cat, so. Yeah, this was probably made in about, I want to say, 8 minutes or so.
Adorable.
Okay, so the way we're going to format this talk is that we've broken it up into 4 lessons learned. And basically, if you're making a creation application or any sort of productivity application where you want people to stay in VR for a pretty long period of time and also use their hands, we feel like these are general principles that kind of apply to all sorts of experiences like that. And so the 4 sections will cover, the environment, using both hands, ergonomics, and designing for flow. And in each of these sections, we'll talk about what worked, what didn't work, and also what future work we would like to explore. So the first lesson probably applies to any VR experience, not just the ones with hand controllers. And that is basically to be responsible for the environment. And the main point is, as developers, we're responsible for the entire visual and oral field of the user, especially in VR. So, as for an experience where people want to spend a lot of time in each session, especially things like medium, it means that we have a particular responsibility to keep people comfortable and engaged. So the main thing to remember is you cannot look away when you're in VR. And Sashka, a director at Story Studio, had a really good quote about this. And I'm kind of paraphrasing a bit, but he basically said, we have to accept responsibility for the environment because of the lack of that first choice. And what we mean by this is, with many other forms of media, like you see here, you can make a really quick choice to look at a screen, look at a book, even like a movie theater screen. You can choose to look at it, but then you could also quickly choose to look away. In VR, the environment fully envelops the user's vision, and the user can look a full 360 degrees around. But what this means is that once you're engaged in the experience, you cannot make the choice to disengage as quickly, except for maybe closing your eyes or taking off the headset, but it takes a little bit more mental effort to do so. So, with that in mind, to start from the beginning, when we first joined Oculus and we told some digital artists that we were making a VR sculpting app, a lot of people got really excited. And then a lot of people were also like, oh my God, I have this idea in my head of this perfect art studio. Please make that. There needs to be sun and lights and tall ceilings and all that stuff. Everyone had this particular idea. So of course, as it often happens with first approaches, we basically took a literal interpretation of that feedback and we're like, oh, what is the ideal art studio? So, we thought about art gallery-like spaces. This is one of our Unity prototypes. The thing we learned about this is this space was not deep enough for people to feel that they can be freely expressive. And then we went to a sort of an art studio warehouse with a deeper space. And modern live-work art lofts, whatever those are. But in the end, these didn't really work for a lot of reasons. What we noticed during user testing is that often people will put the headset on and look around and be like, whoa, this is really cool. But then after a while, when they started sculpting, things in the background became really distracting to them. We noticed that when people wanted to show off their creations, or even when they were working for a really long time, they would basically move the sculpt to the area of the room facing the blankest wall possible, so they could have the most neutral backdrop. And this is this particular one is actually a great example of designing for 360-degree space. In this art loft, when you turned around, there was a staircase that kind of led somewhere. And so people would put on the headset and look around and be like, oh, a staircase, where should I go? I want to go over there and see what's down there. And it basically took them 10 seconds to even get into the sculpting experience. So it's not only about thinking about what you should put in, but also what you should leave out. So we took a step back at this point to think about the goals for the space, particularly for the OC2 demo, since this is the first time we're showing this experience. And so I worked with a concept artist up in Seattle, and he made some concepts for us. And when I looked at these concepts, a couple of them stood out to me. And basically, this one up here, certain visual elements stood out as more important than others. And this is when I realized I needed to basically make an environment that was reduced to a core set of visual elements and leave out the rest so it wasn't a distraction. So the first one is that it should have depth and scale cues. Like, I know we have stereo vision, but since this is an authoring app, it would be nice to have just additional cues to know how big the space is and how big your workspace is, basically. It should feel grounded. It should not be, a sensory deprivation chamber. It shouldn't be pitch black. It shouldn't be floating in outer space without any sort of like grounding. And it should definitely have an emphasis on lighting. Not only lighting is like one of the #1 things that sets the mood of a space. In a sculpting app, it provides additional depth and also shape cues when you're sculpting. And this concept that the concept artist drew up represented those 3 ideas the best. However, this was a great example of how concepts can look great in 2D, but when you think about actually being in the space, it kind of feels like you've dropped down a sewer drain or something, or you're in prison. So even though we have all the core elements here, we still had to think about the space a little bit. And this is what we ended up with for the OC2 demo. A user tester actually called this a sculpting fortress of solitude, which I thought was pretty appropriate. And so what works about it? There are no distracting background elements. There are no literal architecture so that people aren't like, oh, this art studio sucks or something. It's still organic, but still structured. We decided to put repeating elements on the ground, those hex tiles, to provide additional scale and depth cues. And there's also a strong rim light that highlights the contour of the sculpture. But in addition to that, we added a light that the artist can move around as they see fit. And in addition to visuals, we also put an ambient wind sound at that long, narrow doorway that you see there. And that not only helps the user feel the boundaries of the space, but it also helps orient the user towards the front of the room. And of course, the lighting is more dramatic than what you might want in a neutral authoring environment, but since this is an OC2 demo, and it's also the first time we're showing this, I wanted a more dramatic space that kind of gave this 2001 moment. So in the future, we definitely want people to customize their own space, but for the first pass, we wanted to focus proving out the sculpting experience first. And more importantly, the environment is really good at providing ambient cues. For example, this example here would be modulating the time of day lighting based on the actual time of day. Because what we noticed is that people often lose themselves in the work and lose track of time. So providing any sort of ambient cues from the real world would be a good idea. And so another thing to talk about in the context of environment was the many of experiments that we did adding UI elements to the environment. And there were obvious upsides to this. They were very easily discoverable, and when people saw it, it was obvious how to interact with them. Basically, oh, a button, I'll push it. Oh, a tool, I'll grab it. Another way of putting this is there were obvious affordances to these designs. Downsides include having too many real-world spatial constraints. They felt very claustrophobic, especially when you're seated in the experience. You have all these things crowded around you. It basically gets in the way of the actual sculpting experience. And so in the end, as we added more tools and functionality, it started to feel super cluttered, and we basically realized that we had to move away from this direction. There were a lot of other reasons that we moved away from environmental UI as well, which we'll talk about later in this talk. So to sum up environment and space, Sashka had another great quote. And he basically said, "The memories of VR are not the memories of having seen something, but having been somewhere." So what does this mean in terms of lessons? it is important to tell your story with all angles of the environment. And think about what happens when the user doesn't look where you prefer them to look, which means intentionally design the entire space around you. For example, if it's a front-facing experience or a tabletop experience, maybe if the user looks behind them, maybe you want some kind of cue that will draw their gaze back to the point of interest. And also, think about engagement, but also comfort, because what we notice is that as soon as someone starts to feel uncomfortable or sick, engagement breaks instantly. And so, even though Medium is mainly a sculpting and creation app and something that you're focused on your hands with, we realize that environment and lighting are ultimately the biggest factors that influenced how people felt when they left the space. Okay, so the next section is talking about using both hands, which basically means, as designers, take advantage of two-handed coordination. And so as humans, we're exceptionally good at manipulating things with both hands, especially in relation to our heads. This map is a sensory homunculus, and it basically illustrates how much of the regions of the brain are used to process certain sensory functions and motor functions. And you can see there's a really large portion dedicated to our hand processing. And we certainly notice this in VR for the first time, especially when there are no representations of our hands in VR. When people put on a headset, they'll see an amazing space around them. They might see objects in front of them, and immediately they reach out and they're like, oh, I can't see my hands. I wish I could interact with something. And of course, with sculpting with real clay, it's all about using both hands. So in Medium, one of the first things we show people is how to move the clay around the space. And we want people to freely manipulate the sculpt, but without the real-world constraints of gravity or friction. And it's pretty instantly intuitive to people. People just reach out, grab the sculpt. They can rotate and position. There's a bit of momentum so that when they release the sculpt, it doesn't just suddenly statically freeze in space. And also at the end there, you can see that in order to scale the sculpt, we do a pinch zooming action. And thanks to smartphones, that's like a very intuitive action. So after teaching how to manipulate the sculpt in space, the next obvious thing was to encourage people to hold the clay in one hand and then sculpt with the other one. And in the real world, you can see this is like a very natural thing that we do with a lot of different types of objects. In real-world sculpting, the artist often will use both hands to sculpt, but they will also often use their secondary hand as a stabilizer. They'll grab the base or maybe grab the sculpt very lightly and then use their primary hand to actually do the sculpt action. And since we are so good at orienting our hands relative to each other, this feels way more precise than reaching out in space and interacting with something static in space. And even though this interaction is automatic in the real world, it's something that we had to explicitly teach in VR, just because this type of thing was not available to people before, especially in desktop experiences. So you can see in this video, grabbing the sculpt with one hand, using the other hand to sculpt. It feels very natural. You can orient the sculpt very easily relative to your head. And also, as you may have noticed in the video, the two-handed interaction extends to manipulating the UI as well, which is what I'm about to talk about. So we originally started with the ability to have tools in both hands. Basically, there were two sculpting tools in either hand. But what we noticed during user testing is that most people have a dominant hand and a secondary hand, so we might as well use that to our advantage. And you can see this real world example here. It's a paint palette for oil painting, which you can hold with your secondary hand. So to mimic this in VR, we removed the environmental UI and attached all of the supporting interfaces to the secondary hand. And thinking about how the hands relate to each other in this way made it really easy to add additional functionality and also basically decide where certain menus go. So in this case, this is a very rough concept sketch. But you can see that the primary hand holds the currently active tool, which then naturally contains the menus that are only specific to that tool. And then in the secondary hand, there's the menus that you don't need super quick access to, such as like tool trays that switch the tools, or color pickers, or settings, or whatever. So in a later section, we'll delve more into the menu organization, our reasoning behind it. But in the context of two-handed manipulation, we designed the hand-attached menus to be pointed at with the primary hand. So you basically reach over and point at the tray and to interact with it. And for the same reason that sculpting feels really precise when you have a grounded hand and also like a primary hand, the UI felt very natural as well to interact with this in this way. And we found that during user testing, when we just said, oh, bring up the tray and then point at it to change your tool, most people got it very quickly and also remembered that they could keep doing that. So just a tiny note on spatial audio, and even spatial audio is just like a whole entire talk in itself, so I hope you went to some of those. But it's very important for orienting your hands relative to your head. So I'm going to play this video, so just like pay attention to the audio here. And you'll notice that we modulate the pitch and volume based on how much material you're applying in the world. So when you're moving your hand in empty space, it sounds kind of loud and like pitched up. But when you move through the existing surface, the sound kind of muffles and also kind of pitches down. And we found that this was like a really good spatial feedback, and also made the clay surface feel more tactile. So the main point I'm trying to make in this section is that if you have touch controllers or any sort of representation of both hands, use that to your advantage as an interface designer, because for us, everything we've tried in that space has been all upside. Okay, so the next two lessons I'll hand off to Brian, and he'll start talking about Ergo.
So usually when we start talking about ergonomics in the context of computers, it's like RSI from using your mouse. If you're a developer working in VR with touch controllers and you're trying to build something like Medium, it's this kind of more complex and richer thing. So I kind of think of it as these three things. So comfort first is number one, and then preventing fatigue. And that third one, evoke memory, is kind of the more nuanced of them. I'm going to go through them in order. Step one is hopefully not controversial. We all agree that our app should be comfortable for users. The reason that I'm talking about it is that because working with touch controllers is kind of a novel experience for us, there were some things that we learned here. So the clearest example is we have this slider control that you can kind of see here. And it's like an old speedometer dial. And so you would use it by grabbing it and then twisting it the way you twist like a doorknob like you see on the left. And there were upsides to it, right? I mean, it's visually, you understand exactly what it's doing. It affords interaction well. But it's not super comfortable as a motion, right? When you think about it, those doorknobs, we don't really use them in public buildings anymore. You mostly see the kind of longer lever ones that are ergonomically better. So when we did some user testing, we noticed that it was just an uncomfortable thing to do, and we ended up swapping it out. Again, not going to spend a ton of time on this. My point is just, you might be surprised, right? Things that seem like good designs for other reasons, when people use them, might feel ergonomically uncomfortable, and you need to be prepared to abandon them. So prevent fatigue is a little more complex. That's because there are ways that VR experiences still can't be quite like real-world experiences, obviously. You know, it's like if you're working in real clay, Lydia's talking about how you often hold the sculpture with your support hand to stabilize it. While you're doing that, you're actually putting a lot of the weight of your arm on that clay. It's able to support you, or your work stand, or something like that. And we don't have that yet, right? You know, you can't, you know, when you're holding the touch controllers in the air, you're really supporting them. And so when it comes to fatigue, there's a few simple principles, right? So as you can see here, if your arms are raised and your shoulders are holding them up, your shoulders get tired super fast, right? If you just stand like this for 2 minutes, it's you know, it's crushing. So you really want your upper arms kind of hanging down vertically, relaxed, and your forearms coming forward at 90 degrees. And you also want some amount of motion, right? You don't want people really rigidly fixed in place doing the exact same motions over and over. That's kind of fatiguing too. So Lydia was just talking about how we manipulate the sculpture and how we attach menus to your hands and how those are really satisfying experiences. They're also about reducing fatigue. So right, being able to freely scale and move the sculpture around means that you can work with it wherever you want. If you're working on like a tall monument, you don't have to like work on the head by doing this. You can grab it, you can pull it down, you can scale it, you can work with it kind of comfortably with your arms in an ergonomically good position. And the hand-attached color picker is another good example, right? You don't have to reach your arm out to some distant point in space every time you're trying to change color. You can just have your hands in your lap and you can make a pretty subtle motion with them to point them at each other. So step 3, evoke memory, is the most subtle, like I said, but I think it's where a lot of the magic is. Nobody ever uses a mouse and keyboard and says, hey, holding this mouse reminds me of when I was a kid and I used to go fishing with my dad. Right, because holding a mouse doesn't feel like anything. I tried to think of experiences that you could emulate with a mouse, and all I could think of was a wood plane and a mandolin. And shockingly, nobody has hit wood planing or vegetable slicing experiences. On the other hand, right, the touch controllers are just these things that you hold in your hands, like a lot of things that you hold in your hands. And there's a wealth of history here. Humans have been designing and using hand tools for literally millennia. So we've been experimenting with them for a while. One of the things we did in Medium relatively recently was to change the angle and offset of the tooltips. Originally, it was you'd hold the touch controllers and the tooltips came off directly forward. And we changed that recently, you can kind of see here, to mimic how you hold a stylus. It's a little dark, so hopefully you can make it out. And so that angle, you can see on this slide, we changed the ergo of the tools so that it points off in a similar direction. So we did that to reduce fatigue and to increase your range of motion, because it kind of lets you keep your wrist really neutral while you're using the tools and lets you kind of articulate it like you might with a stylus. But when we put it in this, or when we put the offset in this way, we found this kind of interesting thing where there is this, it's kind of hard to describe. It's like this suchness or this feel that the tool has given the tip direction. My theory is it's because it evokes your memories of using other tools that are shaped similarly. So we've been working with a bunch of sculptors that we know, and one of them, this guy Andrew Kars, first used it and mentioned that the tip offset reminded him of using a welding torch or a Dremel, or his specific references, because of the angle. And so he said, it feels industrial to me as opposed to artistic. Right, and to me as an engineer, I found it super fascinating because, right, the actual offset change in code is just like a position and orientation, like nothing. But then when you push that through a given user's wealth of experience with all of these different tools, it becomes this super rich thing, right? Like to call an experience industrial versus artistic is like super nuanced. And it's because we have so much memory built up over our lives of using all of these hand tools. So for this lesson, obviously Ergo is about comfort first and preventing fatigue. But I also wanted to make the point that it's about evoking memory, right? In VR with touch controllers, you'll be able to tap into these rich banks of past experience that your users have when you give them something that feels like something they already know. And my point here is it's going to surprise you, right? Because you're going to do something subtle like, oh, let's just kind of change this offset, and then suddenly people are going to have this totally different reaction to it. It feels like we know a lot about ergonomics with mice and keyboards, but bear in mind, they've only been around for a couple decades, right? Like human hand tool design is millennia old, and it's so pervasive that most of us just take it for granted. So what I'm saying in this lesson is, I think it's worth being a hand tool nerd, right? Like get really interested in hand tool. Like every time you pick up anything that you hold in your hand and use to do something, it's worth analyzing it, right? Like thinking about like what's good about the design of these things that I'm holding right now? What's bad about their design? You know, why am I holding it this way versus this way? And what other experiences does it remind me of? We started cultivating kind of a fascination with this stuff the more we worked with it. And when we did, it felt like our experiences that we built with the touch controllers got better and more thoughtful. So that was lesson 3. Now the last lesson is about designing for flow. This lesson, in a nutshell, is this. If you're building immersive VR experiences where people are meant to do focused work, think really hard about these kind of inner workflow loops where they need to remain in flow. And if you're not familiar with the term flow, it refers to that pleasant state of absorption where you're so focused on something that you lose track of time, everything else fades away. Flow is the state that you want people to be in when they're trying to do great work. And we think one of the advantages of VR is that the immersion that you can get from VR is super amenable to flow, right? You can get very, very absorbed, but only if you do it right. So what does it take to get people in flow state? It's a little subtle. So to answer that, I'm going to start with a couple experiments we tried that we thought didn't quite work. So this one is what we called our arm's reach prototype. And the idea was you had these UI elements floating in the air. Can we turn that down a little, please? Taking maximum advantage of the space. Lydia's already talked about this a little bit. There were other downsides. It felt kind of cluttered. It felt claustrophobic. You know, in the ergo lesson, I mentioned you don't want super repetitive motion, so having it in the exact same space every time was bad. But it also broke people out of flow. And what do I mean by that? Well, the color picker needed to be pretty far away from the sculpture so it didn't crowd it. But then by definition, it meant that when you had to change the color, you had to move your hand like a few feet to get to the color picker. And then it also meant that you were looking away from your work when you did it. It's a pretty significant motion of the head. So we tried another prototype, which was kind of a sort of in-air marking menu. So you'll see that here. You'd bring it up, and then options come up around your hand right there. And you'd navigate them by moving your hand. And that was better, right, because it was always right where your hand was. And we hoped it would kind of wire in, and you'd get a kind of muscle memory, and you'd be able to do it without having to look. There were a couple issues with that. So it still required you to make pretty gross hand motions, right? It wasn't just a flick of the wrist. So it kind of got your elbow and even sometimes your shoulder involved. The other thing is that it was interesting. Depending on where you started, it's actually different muscular movements of the arm. So it didn't get that muscle memory. So like opening it here involves different arm motions than like opening it over here or up here. So it didn't really wire in. So you still needed to look away from your work. So our experience in a nutshell is that we really try not to pull people away. And that means that we design so users don't have to make gross hand motions, don't have to look away from what they're doing, and don't have to think about another complex system. So that's why we ended up with this hand-attached approach, and we're pretty happy with it. Now, obviously, we can't jam all our functionality into that kind of deepest flow state. So what we did is we have kind of different loops that are like workflow layers. So this first one is our tightest loop, where we thought, like, what can we fit in that people literally don't have to ever look away or move their hand? And what you get here is you're working with one tool. You can change the tool parameters. There's this radial menu on the thumbstick that you can use. You got undo and redo on those physical buttons, so you can use them without having to look. And then, of course, you can hold the sculpture and manipulate it with your other hand. And then we added audio and we added rumble and whatnot to help support it so you can do it and know that it worked even if you weren't looking. So this loop is where you do your most focused work, right? You never have to look away from the point that you're sculpting. You never have to move your hand away from the point that you're sculpting. And you don't really have to think about what you're doing too much. You can really zone in. Then we got, the middle loop is when you need to switch tools or change colors. And that involves, ignore that. That involves using a menu on your support hand and pointing your tool hand at it. And probably it means looking momentarily away from your work. So there's a balance here, right? We probably could have jammed this stuff into the innermost loop if we were willing to make the UI kind of cryptic and undiscoverable. But we're also really proud that Medium is this intuitive thing where we can give all of you guys a 10-minute demo, and hopefully most of you within the first few minutes understood the UI and were able to use it pretty intuitively. Which, like, if you think about it, is kind of incredible. Like, if we sat you down with any monitor-based sculpting tool and we're like, in 2 minutes, you'll be able to use 5 sculpting tools to make essentially whatever you want to the limits of your ability, like, it's impossible. So the middle loop is kind of a balancing act, right? We accept that it's not quite as tight as that inner loop because we expose more functionality here, but we've still tried to tune it so there's this satisfying rhythm while you work. The outermost loop right now is this extra radial menu that you've all probably used. It's the settings stuff. Brings up a bunch of broader options like ancillary functionality, symmetry, lathe. These are actions that you don't really do while you're in the heat of sculpting. If you're going to use symmetry mode, you basically turn it on, and then you sculpt for a long time with it on. So we know that this mode is where we put the things that are interruptions, but where it's fine that they're interruptions, right? Because you are kind of mentally stepping back from your work. So that's where we are today, and I would love to tell you that we have a simple, formal, repeatable process for getting there that I can give to you. The reality is that a lot of this stuff is trial and error. Right? So these are a lot of sketches that we did for other ideas, different styles of interactions, different styles of visual feedback, all about how to keep you in the experience and how to give you access to more information and controls without breaking you out of flow. It was really hard, honestly, because A, we don't even have a language to really talk about this stuff, right? Most UI, UX vocabulary is about windows and text boxes and moving mouse cursors across the screen and Fitz law and stuff like that. So I would talk to my nerdiest UI, UX designer friends and say, it's hard even just trying to talk about these design challenges. And they'd say, well, yeah, I mean, you guys are kind of breaking new ground. And to be clear, that's a lot of what's appealing about it. Like, we're excited to be working in the space. But sometimes it felt like taking stabs in the dark, right? You try a prototype, and then if it wasn't immediately good, it was sometimes hard to know, is it a bad idea or is it a good one that we just need to keep pushing on? And any designers in the room are probably listening and are like, yeah, like, welcome to design. That's what design is. But my point is, right, I made video games for 15 years, and after you make enough games, you get kind of a gut sense. When you implement a prototype, you can look at it and be like, yeah, that'll eventually be good, right? It kind of didn't work out like we wanted. And VR is still new enough for us that we just don't feel like we have that. So it's something we're still working on. And the reason that that matters is because we've got a long way to go with medium, right? I think the biggest challenge we're facing from a UI, UX design perspective is how to handle deep contextual modes, right? We don't even have the foundations to do that. So let me explain a little about what I mean about that. And to start, let's look at monitors where we do have this foundation. So this is Photoshop. It has a ton of modes. And when I talk about modes, what I care about are these contextual groups of information and controls that relate to something, right? Like an active tool or some state that you have set. So where are the modes in this screenshot? This is them, right? Each of these blocks is a dockable thing. It's a set of controls. And on monitors, we know how to do this. We know how to display them. We know how to distinguish them from each other. And we know how to afford entry and exit. Concretely, what I mean is pretty obvious, right? Each one of those is a rectangle. We all understand that you move your mouse cursor over a rectangle to enter it, and then you click on things to use them. That might sound really obvious, like, why are we even talking about it? My point is, it wasn't obvious before we developed these conventions on monitors. And we don't have these conventions yet in VR. And that's something I would really love some help figuring out, because windowed operating systems didn't just emerge from one brain or one company, right? Tons of people and companies over the past few decades contributed to our modern understanding of them. And VR needs that too. So let me use a hypothetical example to show you what I mean about contextual modes in VR. Let's say we wanted to add grid snap to medium. So there'd be some way that we show you a grid when it's active. But now what if you wanted to interact with it, right? Like, what if you wanted to change the spacing between the grid lines, for example? So this is the easy answer. And I am somewhat embarrassed to admit we do have some debug code in Medium for drawing totally like bog standard dialog boxes. And often this is how we'll hook up a first prototype. But we really try not to stay here because it feels like such a punt. It works, but the whole point is that we think that working in VR is better in fundamental ways than working on a monitor. Right, again, we can get a total newbie sculpting in 3 dimensions in a few minutes. But every time we punt and just chuck a dialog box at a problem, it feels like we kind of lose a little bit of that benefit. Right, so we're really trying with Medium to come up with new metaphors here. And even if we use this as a starting point, we try not to finish this way. OK, so what would we do instead? We got a grid. We want to adjust it. Maybe we stick a widget on it. Down in the corner, it affords interaction. Maybe when you move your hand towards it, it lights up a little bit. You realize you can frob it. OK, well then what? We could let you move the grid around like we do with manipulate, but then again, we want to change the width of those grid lines. okay, maybe when you grab it with one hand, we kind of duck everything else, and we add these other elements, and you can grab those with your other hand and do like a two-handed thing like we would do with Zoom already. But getting back to flow state, you'd really like these things not to be so modal in the sense of having to be like, okay, now you're only in grid interaction mode. Now you're only in sculpt mode, right? Like in my Photoshop screenshot, you don't have that, right? You can use any of those modes whenever you want. Well, what's the alternative? Right, so maybe you try rendering all the controls all the time like they do in Photoshop, and they're all interactive, and then you start having issues with clutter and overlap. So the more I thought about this, at some point it seemed kind of hopped out at me and seemed blindingly obvious in hindsight. On monitors, we have a great metaphor for stacking two-dimensional spaces on top of each other, right? And I just mean windows, right? Like you have a stack of windows, you look at it, we all understand what that means, we understand how to interact with them, and we can fit them all in one space. In VR, we don't have a great metaphor for stacking three-dimensional spaces on top of each other. Sorry to disappoint, but I'm not going to end this lesson with like a mind-blowing epiphany about how to do this well, because I don't have one. If I had one, we'd have grid snap in medium right now. I'm talking through this stuff because it's stuff that we think about a lot. Like we really want to represent these complex modes that you visualize and interact with, but you can't just necessarily like carve them up into little isolated regions of 3D space, right? You want them all kind of on top of each other. But how do you do that, right? And how do you let people interact with them? And how do you balance the kind of immediacy you want to keep people in flow with the reality that you only jam so much into one 3D space at a time? We think this stuff is super exciting because it feels like we're at the beginning of something really big. But these are really tough challenges. They're rewarding to work on. Hopefully you agree, because we could use some help. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Lydia for a recap.
Okay. So to summarize the 4 main takeaways of this talk, when designing a VR experience for hands-on work, number 1, be responsible for the environment. Build a space that is not only engaging, but also comfortable to be present in for a long period of time, and use subtle visual and auditory cues to orient the user. Number 2, use both hands. Humans are really great at positioning their hands and heads relative to each other. Use this to your advantage. Number 3, solve your ergo. Study the designs of real-world hand tools so that you can design for control, but moreover, evoke that deeper emotional response. And finally, design for flow. Organize interfaces and controls in a way that lets the user stay focused on what matters so that they can lose themselves in the work. And that's basically where we are so far. Here's a sample of some of the sculpts that have been made in Medium. And I hope this talk has excited you, not only from a, oh, I want to sculpt more or do art more, but also as developers, we need people to think about VR as a wide open frontier and something that is bigger than just games and passive entertainment. And we would really love people to join us in making art creation tools or things that people can spend a lot of time in and basically feel like not only are they getting better at the tool, but they're also becoming better artists as well. So that's it. Thank you so much. And we have a pretty good chunk of time, so if anyone wants to ask any questions, feel free.
I got a question here. Okay, so I just finished my Medium demo, and there's a few things. One, like, have you thought about bringing some physics or haptic feedback to create texture and to create weight? When flipping around the stuff, it kind of feels like you're actually designing a balloon, which is still fun, but it'd be cool to kind of get some weight to your piece. And the second thing quickly is also, I do interface design, and that's what I want to design my interface in VR. Like offering like templates and really good reusable interface elements to be planning things out would be really great. So,
do you want to answer that?
Cool.
Sure.
There's actually a €1 filter on the. So there's a filter that removes just like human hand jitter on the manipulate. So there is a tiny bit of lag. Like we tuned it so you wouldn't feel it. When you add more, The problem is it doesn't feel like weight so much as a frustrating sluggishness. So it's an interesting question, right? The haptics usage, right, so far we haven't spent a ton of time on with the touch controllers, so we want to do that. We mostly used it for UI elements and stuff, like little buzzes to like indicate when you're doing stuff, or a stronger buzz when you're adding more material. I don't know exactly how we would use that to convey a sense of weight, but should ask Michael Abrash about that.
Yeah. But from having a better starting point, we are definitely thinking about that. Like one of the most obvious things is to just have like a library of templates that people can start from.
Measuring tapes and tools and things like
Yeah,
that too.
yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I just had a kind of specific question about a design choice that I was curious about. So when I was using Medium on the right hand, you would use the thumbstick to bring up the tool palette. But using that thumbstick is, unlike a button, it already implies a direction. So like it would highlight a menu on there. But then, at least as far as I was instructed, I'd use my other hand to then point, even though I was already implying a direction on that menu with my thumbstick. So I was wondering why it went that way, or maybe it's just something you haven't.
So there's actually there's an interaction there that we didn't teach during the demo, because we wanted to teach people to point at things, at menus and things. But there's actually a set of like shortcuts in there where basically once you're used to the tool, or if you want to work faster, there's kind of the equivalent of hotkeys, where basically you can swipe, push the thumbstick and then press the button on the same hand to select. So, and we also want to add certain things like, you want modifiers for certain actions, right? You want to be able to press, basically the equivalent of pressing Shift while you're like in Photoshop to do a quick action. And those were things that we kind of stripped out of the demo just to keep it simple.
Okay.
But yeah, we probably should have taken it. It was confusing to people that when you push the thumbstick, it would highlight. We probably should have just gutted that for the OC2 demo, because we weren't going to teach it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, so
Oh,
I'm
so
a...
Can I ask a question in just a second? I just want to say there's a bunch of mics around I'm seeing. I assume someone correct me if I'm wrong. I assume the idea is that you should walk, like there's one here, like someone in the front had a question. So if people are waiting at mics, we'll just kind of rotate through them for questions. Can someone point out, is there someone who can point out how many mics there are in this room?
There's one mic. We've generally been doing all the...
Oh, there's literally only one? Okay, forget everything I just said.
Okay.
All right, go for it.
You're welcome. Wait, hold on. There you go. Hi, so I'm a 3D artist, and I really enjoy sculpting both traditionally and digitally. So I was pleasantly surprised how intuitive the interface was for Medium. So basically, my question was, what are your recommendations on making a strong sculpture for VR? Something that's centered that maybe is traditional, that you 3D scan, or make on a computer?
So was the question sort of like processes for making a sculpture in VR, or?
More design choices that makes it so that when you view a digital sculpture or art piece, that it's emphasized for VR, for viewing it in a VR experience, whether walking around or rotating it.
We think the best way to make a sculpture for VR is in Medium.
Oh wait, but do you mean like when you're actually authoring the sculpt, or like sort of visual things?
Yeah, visual.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's, especially since my background is also traditional clay sculpting, I think I tried to bring in a lot of the things that apply in clay sculpting into Medium. For example, trying to sculpt your forms and planes first, and use lighting should be your friend. Like try to indicate certain shapes and forms and things based on where the lighting direction is, and basically trying to define features and details, probably in the same way that you do traditional sculpting. Hopefully that's our goal.
Hi, you mentioned early on that you did some prototyping in Unity, and I was wondering if you ultimately ended up using Unity or Unreal Engine or C++.
Yeah, no, we ended up writing our own native engine. Unity was really great for prototyping because you can kick together stuff so quickly. Right, Medium isn't actually a game, so the requirements aren't really the same as a game, and the priority was being able to throw as many millions of triangles at the GPU as we possibly could. And we didn't need, we don't need AI and pathfinding and all that kind of stuff. So we ended up writing our own native thing.
Okay, so this question is kind of related to the last one. Like, especially listening to the Story Studio talk yesterday, there's a lot of conversation about like being able to do all of this stuff in VR. And Medium is obviously one of those ways where we're creating content in VR. How much do you foresee in the future us having like things like, you know, you have Maya and then you have Photoshop and you have all these different projects versus having one space that you can do it all? So you create the thing by painting it, and then you maybe like pop up like a shading menu, you pop up a rigging menu. Like, how much do you think that we should be trying to make a thing where you can take it from start to finish versus playing on the specific, like if you're just trying to make clay, then you get to play all the tricks for the polygons?
That's a big question. Right, I think if you actually look at, so in terms of taking it from the perspective of to what extent should we be working on large monolithic art tools as opposed to a series of art tools, it feels like the industry is actually going in the opposite direction, right? When you look at things like Mudbox, right, you've got Mudbox has interop with Max and Maya, and that feels like a much more agile way of doing things because you can have them running live, but then that kind of begs the question of like, do they, just because they're in different process spaces, they're still one experience, right? Yeah, I don't really know, right? It feels like there's a certain agility in making tools that are really good at specific things and making them work really well with each other, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, I would just say that the more functionality that you add to tools, especially when they start to get to the professional art level, the more, you know, basically you need man hours, right? Like these are all like very deep problems that have a lot of like in each category, a lot of problems that need to be solved. But also I've worked with many sort of like, especially not public tools that were internal to certain companies that were just like, we are solving everything in this one thing, right? And you know, there's a lot of memory and like performance and all sorts of like things that you run into. And I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying it's a harder problem. And it would be great if someone did that. That'd be amazing.
That's the other. As you look at existing production art tools, I think you see more. You see as much, at least, the results of evolution as intelligent design, right? So it's kind of how they grow.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm not an artist, so I might be way off base with this question, but it seems to me that this kind of tool is actually ironically more useful to traditional artists who, you know, have experience with actually working with clay, as opposed to, I'm guessing there might be a generation of digital artists who have never touched clay, for example. So I was wondering if you have sort of tested this with power users of conventional software, and have you had pushback, or I can imagine someone saying, this is fun and it's valuable, but I would never actually use this because it's not productive.
So it's interesting because we have tested this with a lot of professional artists who have used ZBrush and other tools. And it really depends on the person. A lot of times, ZBrush people will be like, oh my God, there's this one feature in ZBrush, let me show it to you. Like, please put this in there. And we're like, okay. But also, you also get people who are extremely proficient in ZBrush who are like, you know, there's something very pure and playful about this, and it brings me back to when I just played with clay in art school or as a kid, and just like keep it that way, because it kind of makes the, it kind of puts you in a different frame of mind of like more like sketch-like gestures or just kind of like scribbling around and like being able to doodle and have fun. So it really depends on the person.
I think it really gets at the heart of the interesting thing about this, right? So I was running Bungie's tool teams before I came to Oculus, and working with artists to design tools as an engineer who kind of dabbles in art feels like, the thing that's cool about it is it's like split left and right brain halves, right? Where like the artist can give you reactions, but don't necessarily know everything that's possible. And then you kind of know what's possible, but you don't really know exactly how it's gonna feel. And so I think one of the most interesting things about designing this stuff for VR is you have this sense that like if we just cloned, just like I'm saying, don't clone, you know, like dialog boxes from monitors. If we just like ripped the way that monitor-based 3D art tools work, we'd be missing something. Trying to figure out what that is, right? What's better about VR? It just takes a lot of flight time. So you kind of try to like first impressions we note, but then also it's like as people use it more, I think they have better feedback for us that we've been kind of like integrating. I will say, if you guys haven't seen our Twitter feed, it is just at Oculus Medium. Last night we had Beirate came by, who's the guy, he was at Valve and he was at Weta before that, and he did an amazing sculpture in like 30 minutes. And so there's definitely people, it's interesting, right? Like you see like some pro artists come in and are just really used to their tools and have a little bit of a hard time trying the new metaphors, and some people just come in and are just like, and go nuts.
Hi, I'm Jeff, and I'm a digital artist as well as working with Ringling College of Art and Design on integrating some VR into the curriculum. So just wondering what you guys are doing to collaborate with, education, and if you're looking to really, get involved with, putting this into classrooms so that, people can learn in this brand new medium, which is really, really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, we'd love to talk to you. Right now, the Medium team is 5 people. It has never been bigger than 5 people. So we have we have an infinite list of things that we want to do. That's a big part of it, right? So one of the things we didn't talk about in the keynote or anything, but we showed in kind of limited quantity because it's hard to get people through, is multi-user experience. So like multiple people can be in there and you can be working together and you can be talking. We think that has huge educational potential, right? I mean, because you can just be in there and watch someone work and you're not in their way and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I don't know how much we want to talk about future work. But
That's fine. Okay.
yeah.
Our president has been fond of saying for like the last 15 years that the computer is the next paintbrush. So it's like this is actually being inside of it and using it. So I know they'll be totally on board.
Yeah, and you know what? We definitely want to explore sort of like sculptors that record sessions and then people can play them back, like asynchronously in VR as well.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Hey guys, Daniel, I'm a UX designer with Reflect. First, thanks for sharing all those stuff. It's really, really helpful for me also doing VR UX and trying to hassle with the same problems. So I feel you about your pain.
If you have any good ideas, let me know.
No, we should definitely connect.
Yeah.
My question is, can you please tell us a bit about your experiences with having gestures on the one hand, like the thing that people have always been asking for, the minority display, which is really hard to discover. And on the other hand, working with affordances, which are easy to discover, but are not so good if you're designing for flow. So what is your lessons learned on the trade-offs there?
So, I mean, early on, I wanted to try a lot. We kind of started out with like a gaze-based interface, which was mostly for debug. But then I was like, and I've seen this in other VR experiences as well, where, oh, maybe, undo will be like when you shake your head and redo when you nod your head and stuff. But after a while, like I kind of implemented a really rough version of that. But after a while, like, oh my God, I just want to undo. I don't want to actually like shake my head every single time, especially with this thing on my head. So there's, and also, I mean, other than that, it's just capturing gestures, especially in a 3D space, is more difficult than like capturing on like in a 2D space, right? So especially with different body types and like different ways that people gesture, like a lot of times people would say, oh, draw a circle, and like maybe some people will be able to get close, but then a lot of people, even though it feels like their hand is doing it, it's not like super precise. So it's kind of a harder problem, but it's definitely something we want to explore a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, my preference is for gestures to emerge from things like those marking menu examples, right, where it's just you get good enough at it and we add a slight delay on it, so when you get good at it, you can do it quickly and it never shows up and it feels like a gesture. I feel like gestures, and this is just my bias, but like gestures that are like literally taking the path and looking for like loop detection and all, like I use swipe on my Android phone because it's the best thing I can use, and it gets like every 5th word wrong, right? I mean, it's still like literal gesture detection, I think is not very good generally. I do want to play with the marking menu stuff more. Like, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Cool, thanks guys.
So hey guys, awesome work. I'm just kind of curious in your testing if you've seen any people that were really working in more kind of environmental modes than the inside-out object sculpting modes.
You mean like making environments or building their work in the context of the environment?
Somewhat making environments, and because I mean, my thought is really that kind of at least viewing in VR for a sculpt, it would be good to kind of create art all around and a bit of it architectural type style or environment type style. But I'm kind of more just curious to see if anybody has actually tried and is doing it, and if you've noticed like they're starting to get stuck just with the way that the sculpt is moving about, and if that is sort of painful or.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen examples where people take the cube brush and they kind of like lay down kind of a ground plane as a base, and then almost like use it as like a terrain editor, right? They'll start to like add little things and like add little objects and stuff. But I think maybe it's just a bias of the way we run the training. But after a while, when people are like kind of in this uncomfortable position or something, like trying to like place something in space without moving the object, we just tell them, you can just like scoot it forward. And usually, I mean, I don't know. I think it is definitely more object-centric and like creature-centric, but I've seen people try to make little environments and stuff. And it's probably more the fact that our mesh tech right now lends itself to more organic shapes instead of like hard surface and like being able to make like rocks and buildings and stuff, that maybe people don't tend towards that direction.
Thanks.
Hi, you touched on this a little bit already, but can you elaborate on collaboration modes or anything? Is that going to be part of the initial release? Or the Story Studio guys were, they mentioned like a sculptural storyboarding, application, or using this for that. Obviously, collaboration would be pretty amazing. So, any other details there?
I mean, we don't have any specific release information, but it's definitely, I mean, the name medium is both a play on it being an artistic medium, but also it being a social medium, right? Like, it's definitely a core part of what we're interested in.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't have any dates for you, but I mentioned we're 5 people.
Hi, just wondering what the file format is like. It looked a little bit like a voxel engine there. I'm just wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, it is. It's just, we just pull an isosurface off of a level set, like a signed distance field right now. And it kind of evolved from, in our Unity prototype, we started with just a ton of literal cubes, and then you're marching cubes in, and then you like keep a level set so you can get normals and stuff. That is what we're doing.
Have you done any tests with like 2D, like murals or canvases, like graffiti art, etc.? Like, it seems like the paint tools you have would fit that well, but mostly the tools that we tried were focused on 3D.
I mean, yeah, that's been asked for a few times. Like, we definitely want, right now the paint functionality is actually pretty basic, but we didn't expose a lot of the sort of like softness and opacity and like brush type things that do exist in the current thing. But I mean, it depends on what you want to do, but we could definitely have like a template where you just like load up like a big wall that you can just paint on.
Sketch ideas.
Yeah, so that's
cool. Thanks.
it's definitely an idea.
I just noticed this thing is blinking red at us. If someone yell at us when we have to stop, we'll just keep taking questions until someone. I think this is the last slot, right? So
I think so, yeah.
All right.
I'm not an artist, so I can't make stuff that's pretty, but I can, I could nail together a haphazard table that is functional for me. And Medium's fun, but I'm thinking of the next step where I want to make an object that I can actually use in gameplay, whether it's a boot that I can attach to my foot, and that's my boot, like make myself armor, or, a table that I can use to do something else with that's actually functional. Do you guys have any thoughts about using this as a platform for actually making objects that can be have further functions to them rather than just being looked at?
I mean, I think there's kind of layers to that, right? Like, we don't have to go straight from like 0 to every single person can make the best possible things. The existence proof for that, in my mind, is you look at something like Steam Workshop, right? Like, there's like someone, I can't remember her handle, but she sculpts things for Dota, and that's her full-time gig, right? Because she does so well off of it. And so I think there's an intermediate point there too, where you can have still people that have some training and skill that are able to author that kind of stuff, and then all the way up to making something that's intuitive for everyone.
But you're also talking about like exporting in file formats and things.
Yeah, I don't
right?
necessarily mean like at the level of quality. I just mean like could Medium be a base that other games could use to let their users say, I want to create this a sword, like crappy cartoon-looking sword, but that's my sword, I made it, and then go and use that in gameplay?
Yeah, I mean, I think any other piece of software that has the ability to import 3D models, right? Like, you'll be able to take stuff out of it in the same way that you can take stuff out of any program. It's just hopefully this one will be a little more accessible. You won't have to like have Maya to do it, right?
Okay, so you are thinking about that future of potentially like maybe like a click to just save this into a folder and then you can take that into another game maybe?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I'm sorry. Is this like something that you guys have actually experimented with, or it's just that would be neat and maybe we'll explore in the future?
There was a slide that we had that had some 3D prints that we've made off of things that we've made in Medium, for example,
Okay,
right?
I didn't realize
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So we have
didn't
outported to other formats that other packages can import.
Cool.
Yeah.
Really looking forward
Yeah.
to that because I'm not an artist.
So with a horribly unsteady hand, one of the things I use all the time is like shift click to make straight lines. Is that something you guys think about a lot? It breaks presence to all of a sudden not track perfectly, but I care more about it being an actual edge of a table than whatever shape that tried to actually come out to be.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So we have a lot of, we've experimented with precision, we call it precision guides a lot. It's, for this demo, we stripped it out just for simplicity, but yes.
And I guess, what about animation? Have you guys thought about it yet? Is that too far beyond scope?
The thing I always like to say is that the problem in VR is not a lack of low-hanging fruit, right? There are a lot of things that are awesome and that we could work on. I mean, and not just like for Medium, I mean like across Oculus, right? I mean like every team is working on super cool stuff and you could have 5 times as many people working on it. So that's a thing that we think about.
Hey guys, so I was wondering, are you thinking about maybe doing some best practices for UI, UX for VR applications? Because you guys are an exemplar application for VR.
In my mind, I think it would be more interesting to do that as a community project that we contribute to, because like we don't have, if I was not clear enough, like we do not have all the answers
5 people.
or even close.
What do you mean 6?
Oh no, I don't even mean the size. I just mean like we're like at the tip of the iceberg, you know. So.
Well, we're all going to be solving these problems.
Yep.
Yeah.
Look forward to seeing the rest. Thanks.
I was told to tell you I'm the last question. So question, I haven't actually played around with Medium. So this is a feature I've heard that's not implemented, but I feel like it's something that's probably coming. Say I was making a humanoid figure and made one arm too small. I can stretch it later. Is that something that you guys are thinking about putting like points of contact so that you can actually implement them, pull them, grab them, something like that?
I mean, we're thinking about different ways of doing that. That's certainly something that the professionals that use it ask for. It's just
Yeah, that's probably like the #1 thing that
Yeah.
pros asked for. So.
Okay. Is there a method where you can expand something at this point?
not non-uniformly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
If anyone's actually curious about the surface representation format, the best thing to do is Alex Evans from Media Molecule published an enormous set of SIGGRAPH slides about the stuff they did with Dreams. It's like super similar. I mean, they went way further, right? I mean, they spent a ton of time on it. Go read about that stuff. It's super fascinating. His work is amazing. All right, that was the last question. So yeah, at Oculus Medium is our Twitter account. You can see a ton of sculptures that potentially you and other people made. And thanks for coming, and I hope you had a great Connect.